that was the product that I got. That was the product that I got really interested about. And then through my journey, I learned about Power Query and also Power BI more recently. As Suresh said, this is my book, Supercharged Power BI. There's actually 5 different versions that you can see on the screen. They're all essentially the same book, the same structure, but I have improved my teaching techniques over the years. And so that process of continuous improvement has brought this, what I call the black version of Supercharged Power BI. So this is the latest version with the best techniques, but it's the same teaching technique. So if you've got one of the early versions, it's not going to be materially different for you. So yeah, and I think Suresh has talked about those other things, so I'll leave that there. So I would like just to ask a question, maybe just in the chat window, if people could just tell me, are people on the call, are they sort of SQL people or Excel people? I have these sort of 2 broad categories of people. I just like to get a bit of a sense. Thanks Ed for your support on my book. All right, so okay, so we've got a Power BI. I class Power BI people as Excel people. All right, so look, a bit of both. Okay, good. So, I mean, the truth is that most of the people that, how would I put this? Most of the people that find my style the best style come from an Excel Power BI background. That doesn't mean that if you come from a SQL background, you won't learn from me, because I can help people from any background. But the people who have a SQL IT background tend to have a slightly different way of thinking. They have a different depth of understanding of concepts like tables and relationships and those sorts of things. And often those people can learn using other methods, such as the guys, Marco and Alberto from SQL BI are 2 of the best available that have that background. So I'm not saying you won't learn from me if you have a SQL background, but I tend to think like an Excel person because that was my background. So the second thing I'd like to know is who's actually using Power Query. So I see a few people have put comments in there saying they're using Power BI. So by default, if you're using Power BI, yes, you are using Power Query. But if you're using Excel, maybe you are or you're not using Power Query. In fact, I reckon Power Query is one of the best kept secrets in the Microsoft stack. And in fact, a lot of people using Power Query in Power BI, maybe they don't even realize they're using Power Query, which is a whole nother conversation. But that's good. It looks like most people are using Power Query and using it a lot from what I can see in the comments. So that's fantastic. And so look, I hope there's something here for you today. I mean, I'm a real believer that we all learn, we can all learn from somebody else, and we can learn incrementally. And yeah, so hopefully there's, if you're very experienced, there's something here for you. And if you're not so experienced, I hope there's a lot here for you today. So, all right, so the objective of this session is to talk about the M language. So I'm sure most of you know that Power Query is a UI-driven tool, but it has a very powerful under the hood language called M. And if you start to learn the M language, you will become a lot more powerful in your ability to use the tool. Power Query is a great tool. You can use the UI, you don't have to understand the language, and you can do many, many things. But if you learn a bit of the M language, then it's like a lever. You just get so much more benefit. So I encourage people to start to learn the M language. I remember when I started, I found it very difficult to understand. It was very different to the other languages that I'd learnt. And remember, I'm an Excel guy, not a programmer. So and so I want to share with you some of the tips and techniques that I use to help me become accustomed with the M language. And that's really what this is all about today. And I've got a few examples and I've got a few demos to flush out those examples. And so, yeah, so hopefully there's something here for you. So there'll be a brief intro. I like to be thin on slides, but I do have a summary slide after each of these demos. So 3 demos. There'll be a summary slide after each demo. And Suresh and Ed, maybe at the end of each summary slide, it would be a good place to take questions. If there's something that's coming up in the next demo, I'll defer the question Otherwise, happy to take them rather than sort of hold them all up towards the end, and then we can have any final Q&A. I also, you may be aware that I have a joint venture with Ken Pools at skillwave.training, and I've got a discount code for everyone if they're interested at the end. So yeah, so hang around for that if you're interested. All right, so this is one of the slides that I like to use as I guess, a framework for a lot of the talks that I do. And so I like to talk about 4 logical stages of a self-service BI project. And rather than explain what that means, I'll explain the stages that it should make sense. And so the first stage of any self-service BI project is you've got to get the data, right? So the data in this case can be from any source. It could be a CSV file, it could be an Excel file, it could be a SQL database, it could be Salesforce.com, it could be any source. So job number 1 is to get the data out of that source, in most cases, and put it into the Power BI database, which is a very important point, and that is Power BI is a database tool. It's not a spreadsheet. One of the reasons why Excel people often take a little bit of effort to come up to speed with how that works. So stage 1, grab the data, stick it into the database. Stage 2 then is to model the data. And this is a big topic in its own right, data modeling. But the tool we use for this is Power Pivot, or the analysis services engine inside Power BI. The tool for data acquisition is Power Query. So that's what we're talking about today. But the tool for data modeling is the DAX language and the analysis services engine. And once the data is loaded in its raw form, it's not ready for reporting and analytics. There's work that has to be done. So that's step 2. Step 3 then is you start to build the visualizations. And then step 4, you share using the various techniques that are around. Now, this is a linear flow, left to right, data through to delivery of the report. But the reality is that in real life, you tend to jump back and forward between these different phases. Load some data, do some modeling, build a visual. You realize you need to do some more modeling, so you go back and do some more modeling, build some more visuals, share it, get some feedback, go back and get some more data, do some more modeling. So you tend to jump back and forward. And the session today is clearly on this Power Query piece. It's not that these other pieces aren't important, it's just that we can't do everything. And so just so that you see where this particular talk today fits into the big picture. Okay, so let me get into some demos now. So in this first demo, I'm going to start this process of introducing you to the M language and the user interface. And also the example I'm going to use, I'm going to do a file combine. And in that process, I'm going to grab some data out of a specific cell inside the spreadsheet. And I've chosen this demo because it's a good way to explain some of these techniques. So let me come over here and I'll show you the data that we're going to use. So I've got 4 Excel files in a folder. And if I double click on one of those files, just so that you can have a look at it, I'll just bring it on the screen. So it's pretty simple sample data. And I have set this data up in this way deliberately to simulate some problems that you might have when you're doing this. I could make this just work in a demo, say 3 buttons, it's done. But the reality is it doesn't work that way. And so what I've done here is I've simulated an export from some system, doesn't matter what the system is. So like think of it as a daily export. There's some sort of row of data at the top, which tells me the date that the export was completed. I've got a second, I've got some data here telling me the date of the transaction. And then I've got the product codes and the quantity here. Now, the point of this exercise is that this is not a well-designed source data for the purposes of Power BI. And we need to use Power Query to manipulate this, because ideally, this date here would actually appear down here in a 3rd column. There would be product, quantity, and date. The trouble is that's not the way the source data is. So one of my best pieces of advice for Power Query is never touch the source data. If you have to do anything other than renaming the file, then you're doing too much. If you have to open the file to do something like put a formula in here, then you've taken the wrong approach. So you want to avoid, you want zero touch source data wherever possible, and that includes the file name if possible, but it's not always possible. Okay, so I've got 4 files like this. They're over 4 consecutive days. I want to combine the data. So I'm going to copy the path here. The UI in Power Query is not fantastic when it comes to navigate to a path. I always find it easy just to copy the path from Explorer and import it from there. So, so let's start off with this. I've got a blank workbook here, so literally nothing in it. So I'm going to import data from an Excel workbook. Actually, that's not what I want to do. I want to get data from a folder because I'm going to use the standard file combine. I've actually got a blog article on file combine, which explains in a lot of detail how this works, which I don't have time for today. It's asking me for the path, so I can just paste that path that I cut and pasted. If you click browse, it starts you back at the top of the tree. So cutting and pasting is much faster. So click OK. Then what Power Query does is it looks in that folder and it presents you with a list of the files that it finds. In this case, there's 4. And I'm going to select this combine and transform data. And then what happens is the automated wizard kicks in. So what we're looking on the screen now is the file combine wizard. So this is a set of automated process steps that do a whole lot of steps in the background automatically for you that are quite complicated. And this is just, this wizard helps you execute those steps without becoming a Power Query expert. So it's a very helpful tool. Now, the way this works, the way this wizard works is it says, I'll just open up this file again. The way the wizard works, it says, you teach me how to process a single file. Help me learn how to process a single file. Once I understand how to process a single file, then I will execute that process for every file that I find in the folder. So that's the way to think of this file combine wizard. And so the wizard's saying, teach me how to work on a single file. Which file do you want me to work on? So it'll give you a choice. You can pick one of them. I always recommend you just take the first file. And then it says, how do you want me to process this? So I want to process this sheet. But notice, in fact, there's also a suggested table here. This is relatively new, and this doesn't exist inside Excel at the moment. But I'm going to take this blank sheet. But notice that I lack a lot of the capability here that I would normally expect from Power Query. So this particular wizard will only take me so far. So I'm going to load the sheet. I'll click OK. And I'll just switch the screen. There is a little bug, actually. When you use file combine, you will notice that the Power Query window gets placed behind the Power BI window. That's a bug. I reported that bug several years ago. It's still a bug. So, you know, it is what it is. All right, so I don't know why I've got this table here. This doesn't belong here. I'm just going to delete that. That's that selected table thing. So I must have happened because I clicked it. All right, so once you do file combine, this is what you get. All of this activity was generated by the wizard. Normally you would expect a single query, but everything in that red box has actually been generated by the wizard. And you can imagine that it would have been some work to do that if you didn't have the wizard to support it. Now, I recommend that you turn on the formula bar. The formula bar is turned off by default. Everyone should turn the formula bar on because you cannot learn Power Query if you don't, you cannot learn the M language if you don't have the formula bar turned on. And I would argue that it's actually a challenge to learn more about how Power Query works unless you turn the formula bar on. And so you do that by coming up to the View menu, and then it's off by default. You should turn it on so that you can see what's going on. Okay, now, as I said, I do have a blog article on this, and I'll give you the link in the slide at the end of the deck, but there's quite a few activities over here. Now, these are the 2 important things that you must look at. Let's call it the red query and the blue query. Now, remember I said the way the wizard works is it says, you teach me how to process a single file. once I know how to process a single file, I'll repeat that process for every file in the folder. So that's the high-level process. And so this red one is teach me how to process a single file. And the blue one is, okay, now I'll execute that process for every single file. And so if I look at this second one here, this should be all of the data combined. But you can see there's problems. The column names are wrong. The dates are in these cells. Notice that the product codes are here, but they're all empty here. So this is just basically wrong. The wizard took us so far, but we have to stop because it's not correct. So whenever you have a problem with file combine, I always recommend go back and fix this one first. Go and fix the teach me how to process a single file, get that one correct. Once you've got that one correct, then move forward and do, okay, now it's time to process all of the files in the folder. So whenever you're trying to fix file combine, come back here and click on this query and work on this one first. And I recommend you don't touch these. It's a little bit out of scope for today, so it is in my blog article. Okay, so under this track, this is the single file. You'll notice that we connected to the sample file. We navigated to the first sheet, and then we promoted the headers. And in actual fact, this promoted headers step is incorrect. So if I come back here, we actually, here is the header here. So this is incorrect. And if I promote the headers, now, well, you know, it's just wrong. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove that step. And before I move on, I'm going to just get rid of this first row because I don't need this first row. I do need this date, but I don't need this first row. So I'll just come up here and I'll just say, remove top rows, get rid of the first row and click OK. All right, now I'll come back and talk about the M language in a moment. But so before I move on though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this step. Now, I like to rename, I certainly don't rename every step. I only rename steps when there's something significant that I want to use later on, or if I might want to come back later and do some debugging. So I'm going to rename this step and I'm going to call it the raw data. You can call it whatever you want. I prefer not to use spaces in my table, in my step names if possible. We'll talk about that shortly. Okay, now, if you recall, I said what I actually want is I want a date column. So I want this to say date, and then I want this date here to appear all the way down in this column. And so I'm going to do that in a couple of steps. The first thing is I have to get hold of this data. So when I click in this cell, notice down the bottom, you can actually see the value from the cell. In fact, that's true with any cell. If you click in any cell, you can actually see the value of that cell down the bottom. But if you click in this cell and then right click and select drill down, what happens is that value which previously appeared down the bottom of the screen now appears at the top of the screen. And so notice now that I no longer have a table at all. What I've done is remember before I had this, I had a table, I right click drill down, and now I no longer have a table. All I have is this single value. And I want to introduce you now to the syntax of the M language. And so see this word raw data. Notice that this is exactly the name of the previous step. And so one of the reasons I don't like to use spaces, I'll show you what happens. If I come here and put a space, sorry, if I just, I can't double click obviously, let me just rename. If I put a space in there, notice now how this first step, the syntax is a lot more complex. We use this hash double quote. And the reason this happens is that anytime there's a space, they have to use the double quotes. And anytime they use the double quotes, if they're referring to a step, they put a hash in the front to differentiate between a text string, raw data, and a step, which is a previous step. And so that whole problem, in inverted commas, goes away if you just get rid of the spaces in your step names. And I hope you agree that the syntax is much easier to read. So that's why whenever I rename my steps, I never use a space. All right, so the way the syntax works is it says, show me a step. In this case, the step is the previous step. And so what this piece of the formula says is, starting with this table, typically it's a table, starting with this table, give me column 2, so the value in column 2. So here's column 2. It says, give me the intersection of column 2 and this curly brace 0. So this curly brace 0 is the row indicator, and these square brackets are the column indicator. And so that says, start with the raw data table, find the intersection between now the Power Query language, or the M language, is a 0-based numbering scheme, unfortunately. So the first row is 0, the second row is 1, the third row is 2, and so on. So this says, go back to the previous table, find the intersection of column 2 and the first row, and give me the value. And that's exactly what it does. And so if I wanted to get this value here, quantity, so this is the third row, so I could now come in, the third row is row 2, and that will give me the contents of that cell. So now you've learned something. By using the UI, right-click, drill down, and through this conversation, you now know that you can actually basically hard code using the M language and grab any cell from any table inside your query just by writing the formula like I showed you there. All right, so there's the date, and I'm going to rename this. And this is my sales date. And oh, good. So now I've got my sales date, but now I've lost the table. All right, I need this table, and I don't have that table anymore. I've got this sales date. And so the next trick I'm going to show you is I'm going to add a manual step. So when I add a manual step, by default, Power Query will automatically take the previous step as your starting position. It does that to make the process very easy to use, but you don't have to do it that way. You can start from any step that you want. And so I can say, instead of giving me the previous step, I want the one before, which was called raw data. And so when I say equals raw data and hit enter, I'm back to where I started from. So now this step and this step give me the same result, and I still have access to the date column here. And so now that I've done that, what I can do is come up, and now I can remove the top rows. I get rid of the top 2 rows. Now I can use first row as header. And now that I've done this, I can add a column, custom column, and this will be my date. And notice here that I've only got 2 columns that I can use, but I could hard code something in here, right? I could put a text, I could put a number. And in addition, because this step over here is a scalar value, it's a single value, I can use that inside my sales date. Don't know why the IntelliSense is not helping me. So I can actually refer to that sales date step inside my new column, change the data type to a date, and now I've got my query set up the way I want it. Now, remember, this is just the teach me how to process a single file query. Now that I've done that, you'll notice that this one, now that I know how to do it, combine them all together, this one's broken. And the reason it's broken is because all the column names in this query have changed. The column names have changed since the wizard first produced this step. So this happens all the time, so get used to it. So the next step is to come to this query, start at the bottom, and it's normally this change type step that causes the problem. I always start at the bottom, go up 1, just keep working your way up until there are no errors. And so in this case, it's just the last step, so I'll just delete that. And everything looks a lot better now. So now I've got file 1, 2, 3, 4. The products are all aligned, the quantities are aligned, and notice that the dates are correctly pulling out of that cell within each of the separate files and putting them into a tabular format. I do need to come here and apply the data type I might have to come over here and remove that. And you should always set the data types in Power Query. So, so I would come up here and just do a transform detect data type. Just another little tip as I think of it, I manually changed the date type here. Then I removed a column, and then I manually did an auto detect here. So what I would tend to do is try and avoid doing that if I can. So this is just a cleanliness thing. So I would delete that, come back to this change type again, and then just do a detect data type again. It looks like it was fine anyway. So you can see that by deleting that additional change type, it hasn't changed the result, and it's just streamlined my query. And so now I can just do a close and apply, and that will go ahead and process. And as long as any new file that gets added to the folder is if the same format, as long as that same cell has got the sales date in it, this will just continue to work as you would expect. So I'll just sort of quickly throw together something so that you can see that that's sort of working fine. All right, so just let me summarize that. Now, I will ask Suresh in a minute just to give me a time check, because I can waffle a little bit. But so let me just give you a summary. So if you want to learn the M language, turn on the formula bar. Absolutely fundamental. You won't learn anything if you don't understand what's going on. When you add a step, make sure that you look at it and try and understand what's going on. What I didn't talk about, but this is one of the reasons I have my slides, is that the steps normally work like this. There's a function name, and the first parameter is typically the name of another step. And by default, it's the previous step. And so the way the M language works, it's a functional language, just like Excel is a functional language. So if I said, how do you use the sum function? The sum function is like a black box. You pass it some cells and it will add up the numbers in the cells. That's what the sum function does. Well, the way the functional language in M works is that you pass it a table. Typically, it's a table. You pass it a table. It's the table that would appear in one of the steps in the query, and then it will do something to that table. It will transform that table into a new version of that table, typically. So that's how that works. So you've learned that you can right-click and drill down on any single cell value, and you know how to handwrite those now using this step name, row number, column name syntax. And the other thing that I didn't really call out, but you should have noticed, is that you don't have to execute your steps in the same order as they appear on the screen. You can basically do them in any order that you like. And this is the link to that more detailed blog article about Power Query Combine. All right, so I'm just going to pause there and jump over to Suresh or Ed and see whether there's any questions.
Yeah, so Matt, I had a question actually, and Pranam actually read my mind and typed it in. When you do the transformation of multiple files and you're in that transform sample query, and you did the data types there, the data types do not propagate to your final query that actually does the combine. Do you know why that is? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I agree. I know exactly what you're talking about.
It's
I don't know why. It is very annoying. I don't know the answer. So, but I agree. It doesn't do it. And I mean, the Power Query language is what they call, it uses what they call lazy evaluation. And so what that means is that if you put, so for example, if I came over here and changed this to date time, right? So I replace that current step. And then here, I changed it to date. If you think about it, that previous step, changing it to date time, was not required, because ultimately I changed it to date. So there was no need to change it to date time, yet the date time change still exists. So the way the lazy evaluation of the Power Query language works is that it starts at the end and works backwards. And so it actually only executes the steps that are required to give the output. And so a required transformation is to set this to a date, but it's never required to set the date time format, because that's never used in any of the other steps. So even though I add this step, it actually never gets executed by the Power Query engine. So it's quite an interesting language. And so that's a little side story, but I would suggest it's actually, unless you're doing some sort of filtering here, it's probably not even, I would just delete these It just makes everything cleaner, right? So just get rid of those. It's not necessary. And then I ended up changing them over here, so that's fine. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any.
All right, so Ed, how am I going for time with Suresh? So
right, Matt, even if you go a little bit over, we should be fine.
all right, so look, what I'll do, I'll keep this current pace for the second demo, and then the third one, you know, there's a key. Perhaps I won't complete the whole demo if we're running a little bit late for time, but let's just see how we go. All right, so let me go back to my slides so that I can work out what I'm doing. All right, yeah, so the second demo that I'm going to use is this relative column and row names. And so, you know, once again, the best way to explain the concept is to actually let me do the demo, and I'll show you the problem. And then once you see the problem, I'll show you how to solve the particular problem. All right, so in this example, I've got a single worksheet. Let me just open it up so that you can see it. So I'm going to do a sheet consolidate this time. So last time it was a file consolidate. This time I'm going to do a sheet consolidate. So I've just got some sample data. It's actually AdventureWorks. I made the data up. And notice here we've got January, February, March, April, May for the sheet names. And also notice I've got a couple of blank sheets in here. And so I'm going to do a file combine on these sheets. But I want you to keep in mind that this workbook is going to update every month. All right, so June, July, August, new tabs are going to appear inside this workbook. Right, so that's actually the root cause of the problem, which I'll show you in a second. Okay, so I'm going to come here and I'll do a sheet combine. I'll say get data. This time it is from a workbook. It's from my consolidate worksheets. The wizard pops up again, and notice you would all be familiar with this. Notice I could come here and hand select each of the sheets that I need to load. But the problem with doing this is I'm doing a absolute reference to these sheet names. And then next month when June comes along, I haven't selected June and it's not going to load. So this is not the best way to solve this problem. So I'm not going to do that. There's no apparent way of actually loading all the sheets. There is no, I don't know, it doesn't look right. Now, the way to do it is to right click. So come up to the folder, right click and select transform data. And if you do that, it basically loads the structure of the Excel workbook for you in Power Query. And so now you can see that entire structure is here. Now, the benefit of doing it this way is that when the workbook grows by getting additional sheets, this list will grow, right? So it's self-healing. This is a very important principle of Power Query, is that you need to think through how will your data potentially change in time, and you need to make sure that you cater for that. All right, so now I've got a list, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first of all filter out these sheets. Now, of course, I could just deselect those sheets, but then what would happen if someone came and added another sheet? It becomes sheet 3, sheet 4. And because I'm hard coding this solution, that wouldn't work. So same principle, wherever possible, try and make your solution as generic as possible. So it would be much better to say text filter does not begin with sheet. Click OK. It gives me the same result with the added benefit that if someone adds another sheet in the future, it will automatically remove them. Now, of course, if someone adds another sheet and calls it Matt's sheet, then it's not going to work. But at least there's one use case where it will work, and that is when they added a new sheet and they don't rename it, it will automatically get removed. Okay, so now that I've removed those sheets, I'm going to use this expand button, which is effectively like that file combine wizard that we used before. So I'm going to expand. I'll just take all the columns as is. And when I've done this, notice there's a couple of things that happen. First of all, there is no wizard. And so I'll come back to that in a minute. But if I want to proceed, I'll use the first row as header. Notice now I've got the product key, but this one is wrong. I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing I should do is I should come down here and click load more. And so see, I get this error. We couldn't convert to a number. So this is a very typical problem that used to occur a lot before the file combine wizard was invented. And what's happened here is that when I promoted the headers, Power Query automatically changes the data type for you. It's trying to help you. It detected that this product key is a numeric column and it changed it for me. Look back here, so unknown, it automatically changed it, but there's a problem. And it's too late. Once you click on the change type step, it's too late to understand what the problem is. Because if I click here and go load more, it throws an error. It just says we couldn't convert to a number, but it actually doesn't tell me what the problem was. And so I like to delete that step and then try again. Come down, load more. And if you look down here, you'll notice that this product key column heading has appeared again. So every file is going to have the first row being that product key. So if you're using this sort of manual combine method, you must remove the additional columns that get added, in this case, from the additional sheets or the additional file. So just a little trap to watch out for. Once it's happened to you once, pretty much you'll remember next time that it happens and you'll be able to fix it. All right, so the problem now, of course, is that this column is called May, and I don't want it called May. I want to call it month. And so if I go and make that change, now let's come back and have a look at the anatomy of a function again. So let's have a look at this function. So this is a function called table.renameColumns. The Power, I keep calling it Power Query language. The M language is case sensitive. So if I put rename columns with a lowercase c, it throws an error. So the M language is case sensitive, which is very annoying, but let me just go back. So that's the correct syntax. And so the way the function, so you specify the name of the function. The first parameter is typically a table from a previous step. And notice here, filtered rows was the previous step. So what this function says, I'm going to perform a function, table.renameColumns. I want to take the table that I had previously. So it says I want to take this table, and then I want to find a column called May, and I want to rename it month. So it says take this table, find the column called May, rename it to month, and that's basically what the table.renameColumns function does. And most functions in the M language operate similar to that. There are definitely exceptions. All right, but here's the problem, right? So what's going to happen next month is that someone's going to come in here and they're going to do a new extract. They're going to create a copy. I'll just create a copy, but they're going to load some new data for June, and they're going to save the file. And you're going to come back here and you're going to go refresh preview, and now it throws an error. And the reason it throws an error is that you explicitly said, find a column called May and rename it to month. But if you look at this previous step, there is no column called May anymore. The column is now called June. Just give me. Okay, so hopefully you see the problem. The problem is that because of the way the query works, the first sheet in the workbook can change over time. And if the first sheet changes, then when you do the promote headers, we have a different column name. And now we've got this problem here. So that's the problem that we're going to solve. So what I'd like to be able to do, just excuse me. Sorry, I should have brought a glass of water. What I'd like to be able to do is I'd like to be able to do a relative reference. So I'd like to rename the column, but not using the named reference to the column, but doing the relative reference to the column. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So let me delete this step for now. And in fact, I'll just leave that. I'll leave that there for now as well. Now, over here, I'm going to create a new query, and it'll be a blank query. And this is a little trick that you can use. And there's a special function in the M language called equals hash shared. And I think I learned this from Reza Rad from Rad Academy in New Zealand. I reckon that's the first place I heard about this. So equals hash shared, lowercase, it's case sensitive. And when you type that in, you get this list of all, amongst other things, all of the functions inside the M language. So this is a list, and I can convert that list into a table. And once it's a table, I can come down here and I can search. So this is basically self-documentation. And so I need a function that's going to help me change the column names. And so all I have to do, column names, okay, that doesn't work. You just sort of got to go looking. So if I type in column names, you'll see that there's a function called table column names, another one called table transform column names. So I'm going to take this one. Click OK. And if I click, I won't click on this hyperlink, but if I click in the space, you get the documentation down the bottom of how the language works. And so this is the uses. It's table.column names. And unfortunately, this is computer generated sample code, so it's not particularly good. The other thing you can do is you can click on this, this hyperlink, and it will actually invoke the function for you. And so you can specify the table and it will show you how it works. I'll show you another example of that in a minute. But the purpose of this exercise to start with was to find out what is the name of the function that I want to use. And this is it, it's table.column names. If you look at the syntax, it returns the column names in the table as a list of text. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to come back here, and I've promoted my headers, and the first column is called June. And I want to be able to reference that first column. So I'm going to add a new step. Now there is IntelliSense inside the M language, but it's a little bit flaky. And so I want to start typing in table.column names, and notice how the IntelliSense is working. But look what happens if I come down to column names and hit tab. In actual fact, in that case, it worked. But if you've got to be a little bit careful, because when you do that, it can actually overwrite any other functions that you've generated. I think I can show you a use case of that later. So what I always do when I'm writing my own functions is I always put the open bracket first, and that will prevent most of the issues. So table.column names, tab, and close brackets. And now I get a list of all the column names inside this particular table. Which table? This one here. Now, using the techniques that we already know, I could, of course, right-click, drill down, and that would give me the name of the first column in the table. But I encourage you to use what you learned about the M language. And so I think in this case, I can go curly brace 0. I don't have to specify a column name in this case, because this is not, previously, this one here is a list. The difference between a list is like a single column table. You can also have a table with one column that is a table, but this is a list. And if you're referring to a list, if I was to do this drill down, you'll notice that it doesn't refer to, I didn't mean to do that. If you do the drill down, you don't have to specify the column name because it's a list, not a table. So instead of drilling down, I can just hard code it like I showed you before. So give me the first item in the list, and notice that this is a scalar value. So this bit of code actually tells me the name of the first column in the list. So the name of the first column in the table. And so I'm going to rename this, and I'll call this my first column. And then I'm going to add another step. And instead of starting with the previous one, I want the filtered row. So I'll go back and get the step from earlier. Now that I've done that, here's the name of the first column. Here is the table I had before. using the user interface, I'm going to rename this column. I'm going to call it month. Let the user interface generate the code for me. But now, instead of hard coding this, saying find the column called June and rename it month, I'm going to use this piece of code that I generated. So I'm saying find the value up here and use that. And so when I do this, nothing different will happen, right? Because it still works. Because the first column is June, and that's exactly what happens. But now if I come back here, and what I'll do just for, of course, if I come up with July, I'll create another one. So now July is the first one in the list. And if I come back here and do a refresh, no error. It just works because I've made an absolute reference to the first column in the table instead of doing a relative. Sorry, I've done a relative reference to the first column in the table rather than an absolute reference to the column called June, and therefore it works. All right, so that's the second demo. Just let me summarize those key points. So the hash shared function is a good way to find a function if you're not familiar with the language. You can also use IntelliSense, so that works. I use this function all the time, and I just know it now. Table.column names, IntelliSense helps me find it. And I just can append curly brace 0 on the end to get the first row, or curly brace 1 to get the second row. And notice how I use the UI first, and then because I don't have the skill to write this code off my own bat without doing anything, because I'm not a programmer, but you don't need to. So use the UI to do the hard work, and then just modify what's been done by the UI using the tricks that I'm showing them. Okay, so let me take a breath and I'll back to Ed.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions.
Okay,
so
that's good.
I think we're good. Although I will say that tip about putting the parentheses before the IntelliSense overwrites, I was not aware of that. So
yeah, I'll
that
show you
the most
that
useful thing.
Okay, good. Well, this is the reality, right? Is that we're all at a different stage on our journey, and we've all picked up different things. But unless you actually sit through, end-to-end presentations, you can't get the little nuggets that you've previously missed. And so it's not uncommon for people to sit through a presentation and just pull away a few bits that are different to someone else who's in the same presentation. All right, so let's have a look at the third demo. And so what I'm going to show you is, once again, this is a use case which I've created because it helps me show you some of the tips that I want to demonstrate. And this is how I go about building a calendar table from scratch. So basically, I'm not loading any data. I'm going to start with a blank query and load it up inside Power BI. So let me jump over here and I'll go into transform data. And this time I'm going to do a new query, starting with a blank query. And exactly as it suggests, there's nothing there. And basically, I'm in the full UI experience now. So I have to write every line of code that I want, although I will start using the UI shortly. So the first thing I want to point out to you is that if you use curly braces, these curly braces are actually called the list operator. And so I can do things in curly braces like this. I can do 1, 2, and that creates a list. It's a list that's got 2 rows. Now remember, a list is like a single column table, but because it's not a table, it doesn't have a column name, it's just a single list. And so, I can do things like this. So you separate the items in the list with a comma. They don't have to be of the same data type. So I think I could do this. Let's go 1/1/2021. So actually, that's actually done a division, but I'll come back and have a look at that in a little bit more depth later on. All right, so this is the list. Now, also what you can do with the list is you can do something like this: 1:10. Give me a list of numbers from 1 to 10. Now, I'm going to build a calendar table, right? So I want a list of dates. So one of the things that I could do is I could say, give me a list of numbers starting from 43831 and going all the way to 44,000. Now, when I get those numbers, I could turn that into a table. Once it's a table, I can change the data type into a date. And this is the international date format, guys, sorry. So it's 1st of January, 2nd of January, 3rd of January. But you'll notice that this list of numbers, it uses the same or very similar number of formatting to what Excel does. So just keep that in mind. All right, so this is one way that I could do this, but that's not the way I'm going to do it this time. I just wanted to draw your attention to this list operator. So I'm going to do another query, blank query, and I'm going to use the equals hash shared. And let's go and find, I need to create a list of dates. So same trick as before. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to filter. I need dates. So I'm going to search for dates. In actual fact, if I do date, I get a stack of things. But if I accidentally actually hit dates plural and there's only one item, and that's the one that I need. Now, I know these functions, right? So clearly it's easier if you know the name of the functions, but just, come in here. If you can't find it, just look, just do a bit of searching, and here they are down the bottom, list.dates. So I'm going to take list.dates, and this time I'm actually, here's the syntax, but I'm going to trigger this function. And when you click on that hyperlink, it actually invokes the function. And so I'm going to create a list from 1st of January 2021. And notice how the fact that it's giving you this syntax wizard means that you don't really have to understand how the function works. It wants to know count, how many days you want to increment. So I want to go say, let's just do 10 days, and I want to increment by 1 day. So if I do that, it generates a list of dates. But notice how I've been able to use that inbuilt functionality to understand how the syntax works. Now, this is a little bit interesting because it's saying value, and then this is the date that I entered. This is the duration, and then, but notice how Power Query actually wrapped a whole lot of extra functions inside the code for me without me having to really understand how they work. And this is not the name of the function. So if I come back here, value actually contains, so filtered rows is the name of the function. And then when I click on value, it's actually, this is invoking the function here. So it's a little bit hard to understand, but suffice to say that this is the same as list.dates like this. If I just typed in list.dates like that, that would work. All right, so I'm going to copy that bit of code, Control copy, and I'll come back here and I'm going to use this as my source. So list.dates starting from that first date. All right, so now the second thing is that I don't want to hard code the starting date inside this function. And so I'm going to add, I basically want to replace this step with a step over here. So I'm going to add another step manually. It says I'm going to start with the source, but no. Now, remember before I did 1/1/2021, when I typed it in like that, it basically did a division. But I only learned this by mucking around. I don't know, is that if you don't use the equal sign, it actually treats it like a date. And so without using an equal sign, I'm going to rename this, and this will be my start date. And now that I've got this start date, I can come back here and I can replace this piece of code with the start date. Okay, now notice that the start date comes second. The source code comes first, the start date comes second. But inside the source code, I'm using the start date, which hasn't even happened yet. So the Power Query M language is not a sequential language. You can jump over in any order that it wants. And so I'm actually able to use the start date, even though that appears later down the list. All right, so how are we going to work? I mean, ideally, I'd specify the end date and it would just work. but I can't do that. How am I going to specify the duration? So I'm actually going to have to work out what the end date is and then subtract it from the start date to work out how many dates that I want. So let me add another step. And I want this calendar table to grow. And in order to grow, I'd like to use today's date. I'd like it to be today's date. Now, this time I won't use the source, the other syntax. Instead, what I'll do is I'll just see if I can guess it using IntelliSense. So I want today, right? So there's no such function as today. If you're an Excel user, you probably would try today. Okay, that doesn't work. What else could I try? Now, all right, so this shows some promise. So date time, there's one called date time local now and fixed local now. There's UTC codes. I'm just going to use local now. And I don't really know what the syntax is. I can have a look at the IntelliSense, but we'll just try it like that. And there we go. We've got our function that tells us that it's the 7th of October and the time is 12:37 here in Sydney. Makes sense, it's a local time. All right, so that's the date time. And so if I try and I put that in the wrong place, so let me just move that up. If I now try and subtract the start date, I get an error. And best advice I can give you is read the error messages. We cannot apply operator subtract to types date, time, and date. So that's telling me what the problem is. I'm trying to subtract this item here. If I just let me delete that. I'm trying to subtract this date time from a date, and that's not allowed. So now what I need to do is I need to extract the date only portion of this. So Ed, here's the trick, right? So if you type in, I need the date portion. So I don't know, I'll start typing in date. So I think it's date time dot date. And if I hit tab, notice it replaces the code that was there before. So very annoying. And the way to fix it is before you start typing something in front, put the open bracket, and then it's date time dot date tab. And as long as you've got that open bracket there, it's quite happy. So I'm going to close it off. And now I've got a date. So this is today's date. And from there, I could subtract the start date and hit tick. And there's 279 days between the start date and this end date. But notice that this is not an integer. And just to save a little bit of time, if I try and use this, it's going to throw an error because this is a very specific function, which is a date. It's basically a date time format. So this is days, hours, minutes, and seconds. And so I need to extract the day portion. So same as before, I'm going to come in here and I need to extract the days. And so there's one here called duration days. Look, I'm not saying you're going to know what all these functions are when you start, but using the hash shared, using IntelliSense, just have a go. You can't break anything. So duration.days, hit tab, and that extracts the piece of information about how many integer days there are. And in fact, there's one more thing. If you're building a calendar table, you should always take the calendar through to the end of the year if you can. And so I'm going to basically do a date dot, I think there's end of year. So basically I'm going to teleport into the end of the year. And so there's 364, and I'm guessing I should add one day to that. So 365. So this code becomes the duration. And if I come back to the source, I'll just refresh the preview. Sorry, that was wrong. So that was the start date. And this one is the duration. And there we have it. We've got a list of values going all the way through to the 31st of December 2021. All All right, so now remember, I'm down here. I've got to add a new custom step, and I'll go back and grab the source step. And once I grab the source step, it's all working. And now I can go through, convert it to a table. I change the data type to a date. I call this the date column. And now that I've got my list, this now forms the basis of my query. At any time, and what I typically do with these queries is I come up here. Well, let me just do a couple of steps. So what I would do now is I'd go add column, add the year, and then I'd add another column, and I'd add the month, and add another column, and I'll add the month name. So basically you build out your calendar table with all these steps. And once I'm finished, what I tend to do is I come up to the advanced editor, copy this code, Control C, and I typically store it in OneNote, but you can store it anywhere you want as a text string. And now, once you've got this code, it's very easy. Whenever you start a new Power BI report, cut and paste this code, paste it into a blank query, go into the query and change the start date. Just all you have to do is go and change that to whatever year you want to start, and everything else will just basically work automatically from there. Okay, so I'm going to just show you the summary, and then I'll open up for any other questions. So yeah, look, I learned some of these tricks by reading books. Ken and Miguel have got a good book. It's now called Master Your Data. You may be familiar with that book, this one here, Master Your Data is a great book. Chris Webb's got a good one as well, but it's getting a little bit old now. But I learned a lot of these tricks from reading those books. So use the hash shared keyword we talked about before, and then yeah, generate the code in the UI and then insert it back into your code down the track. So yeah, look, I think that's pretty much it. As I said at the start, I'll just sort of give a plug for SkillWave. So we have a couple of Power Query training courses on SkillWave. There's a free course here. It's got a couple of hours of videos. It's introductory, but you might pick up something that you've missed. This course is $350. I've got a 20% discount voucher using this code here and the QR code if you're interested. So you need to use this discount voucher on checkout. In fact, that voucher will work across any training product that we have at SkillWave Training until the 17th of October, just for you all. So with that, I'll throw it open for any questions, or if there's nothing about what I've talked about, I'm more than happy to answer questions about anything. So I'll throw over to Ed and Suresh.
Sounds good. Anybody has any additional questions? This is a lot of good content, Matt. A lot of
great. Thank you, Suresh.
So anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question or type it in and we'll read it out. Like Matt was mentioning, any generic questions not related to this or anything in general, feel free to ask.
There's a question from Pranam there about financial year calendar. Pranam, what's your financial year?
Pranam, feel free to unmute if you think that helps and talk. Okay, it says July 2021. Okay, 1st of July is the start of your financial year. Okay, that's the same as the financial year in Australia. We start on the 1st of July. And as luck would have, I've got blog posts on many things because I always say to people, look, I'm on the same journey as you. What's different is I'm 7 years in and you may be less than 7 years in. The other difference is that this is all I do every day, whereas most of you have a day job that you have to keep a boss happy, somewhere along the line. So yes, I have a solution for the financial year. Now, here's the trick. When I added the insert year, look at the code. This is the benefit of learning the M code. So I'm adding a column. It starts with the previous table that I had, which is the one without the year column. It's added a new column called year. And it seems to take the current date as the input to extract the year. That's what the function thing does. It's this date.year. It extracts the year from the date. And it's sort of, if you know any DAX, it's a bit like a row context, right? So it takes the date, but it's the single date for the single row in the new column. Now, here's a little trick, and that is if you add 184 days to any date, it will click over into the next year. So if I was to add 184 to this, well, it's going to throw an error, first of all. So if I go plus 184, it throws an error. Now, do you remember from earlier on, I said you learn from the UI. So remember this, see this step here, this duration? This is the way you have to represent 184. So I'm going to copy that code. I'm going to come back here and I'm going to add 184 days. Now, when you do this, if I scroll down, let's have a look at June, July. Notice that on the 30th of June, it says that the year is 2021. And on the 1st of July, it says the year is 2022. So 184 days is the number of days between the 1st of July and the 31st of December. So if you add 184 days, it will automatically work. What I would do if this was the case is I'd come up and change this to fin year and go from there. Then when it comes to the month, you can't use the same trick here. So what I would tend to do is this is going to generate one for January. So I would then do something like I'd probably generate the month number first, and then I'd do a fin month. So I'd add a column, custom column, and just the way you would probably do it in Excel. So I'd say if the month is greater than or equal to 6, then I want the month minus 6. Otherwise, or else, that's the correct syntax, I want the month plus 6. And so that will give me 7 through to 12 at the end of. Now, this is actually wrong, so good to check. 11, 12, it must be, if month is greater than or equal to 7. So January 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then July is the first month of the year. So they're the two techniques that I use. Did I have a calendar? No, I didn't put a link for the calendar, but if you go to my blog and just search for, if you want a full tutorial, just come here and search for Power Query calendar table. And this is the full article on how to build that entire calendar table, including the financial year tricks that I just showed you. So they're all covered in there. Okay, thank you for the good question. Any other questions?
I have a general question, Matt. This is about, if we create a Power BI report and publish it onto the Power BI service, there are some needs. And again, this is a temporary solution before people are trying to work out a more permanent solution. They want to export that data out to an Excel and export that Excel or place that Excel somewhere where another process is going to pick it up and process. I saw a blog post of yours, but I thought of quickly asking that question, how can we do that?
All right, so you want to get the data out of Power BI in a tabular format?
Yes.
In Excel? Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so I use a trick, and so if I jump into, so I would use Analyze in Excel to do this. So load the data up into your workspace. If I come over here, let's just have a look at VentureWorks. So here is my report, and I can go Analyze in Excel. It generates the Excel file. You open the Excel file. You have to authenticate with the correct credentials. A couple of enabling, and I should see up here. Okay, so here's my file. Okay, so what I want, this is a pivot table connected to the data model, but I don't want the pivot table. I want a table. And so this is the trick. You first of all need to generate a pivot table, and I'm just going to, let's just put day name and stuff. So this is sales by day. So step one, build a pivot table, any pivot table, doesn't matter. Step two, double click on one of these cells. You may have done this in Excel before. So this is the drill down. So double click and it generates a new sheet. And that new sheet returns the first 1,000 rows of raw data that makes up, that are used to calculate the sales by day. Here's the trick. You then right click on this table and come down to table, edit query. And this is the connection string that connects through to powerbi.com. And this is actually MDX code, but you can replace this MDX code with any valid DAX query. So any DAX query that returns a table. So you must start with evaluate. And then any table function you can use. So I'll say all color. So it's actually all. Now there's no IntelliSense and there's no U in color. So that's a valid DAX function that returns a table. So if I change that code, I suspect there's products is plural. So let me just come back. That's where the IntelliSense, all products. Let's just try that. Okay, so there we have it, a table containing all of the product colors. I can edit that query some more. And I mean, if you know DAX as a query language, I have a full set of 4 or 5 blog posts on my website about teaching you about DAX as a query language. But the simplest query you can write is evaluate customers. All right, so when I do that, it just gives me a copy of the customers table.
Right.
But what's important is that this is a live link. So if I right click and hit refresh and the source data changes, this table will refresh. And then, you know, once you get a little bit more DAX skill under your belt, you can do something like summarize the sales table where the customer's name, and give me, this is not great code, by the way, but just cut me some slack, total sales. So this is a DAX query. It could be written more efficiently. And so now that goes and gets me a table of all the customer names and their total sales in my database. And when you refresh this workbook, it will just continue to work. So that's how I would suggest you do it.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, we're trying out different solutions, and you know, we're just looking for something that's simplistic. You know, one approach that we're trying to do is doing the Power BI API. But if there is a simpler solution, we won't try that out before resorting to the API. Yeah.
The only thing you'll need to do is you'll need to open that Excel file and refresh it. But if that's not a problem, then that can work. You can also automate that using a bit of code, or there's a few products that can use that.
Probably Power Automate, right? We can just go ahead and use Power Automate to do a refresh.
I'm not sure if you can use Power Automate to open an Excel file and refresh it. You can certainly refresh the data model, but I'm not sure that you can refresh a workbook connected to the data model. You could use Power Update, which is a commercial product, but Power Update has a free version. As long as you're updating a single workbook, you can set it on a schedule. Just at 8 o'clock every morning, we'll just open the file, refresh it, and close it again for you.
Got it. Sounds good.
Thanks for putting the link for calendar tables in. And then the other one, yeah, on my website, if you search for DAX query, a few website problems lately. So there's a series of them. Got to find the first one. I'll put it. This is the first one. So I'll put this one in the chat. This is the first of a series of 3 or 4 different articles. DAX is a query language. And it takes you through the things that we've talked about and how to learn DAX as a query language and so on. Okay.
Any other questions?
Anybody has any other questions? Okay. Thanks, Matt. Much appreciated for your time. Thanks for good information that you shared. Again, I'll share the link to this recording. And what is your blog again?
Well, the shortcut for my website is XBI. So my company is Accelerator BI, but I have a shortcut version, just xbi.com.au. So yeah. xbi.com.au.
Okay, fantastic.
So, yeah.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
Good. Great. Thank you. Glad you liked it. So thanks for joining. Good luck.
Thank you. All right. See you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Bye.
See you, Matt.
Bye.
Bye.